Welcome back to the channel. Today we're finally getting some materials and we're finally able to start this retaining wall build. So with that, let's get right into it. The first material we're getting delivered is the 6x6 landscaping lumber that I was ordering in the last video. My initial estimate in the last video was going to be about $3,100, but that did not account for a bulk quantity discount, so the actual price delivered was $2,300. While this price still is more than the railroad ties I was initially planning to use, it is still a lot cheaper than I would have gotten it without that discount, so I will take what I can get here. And to give you some idea of scope of just how much lumber this is my SUV parked next to it. It is literally almost as tall as my car. I also took the time to get some rebar that we'll be using to stake this lumber into the ground. Now let's jump back into the backyard and into our first set of problems. The first step of the retaining wall is to have a nice flat level base that you can put that first layer on. Otherwise, the entire wall above it is not going to be level. It's going to have that same angle or those same imperfections. And taking your time to get that base layer right is really important. If you look down here on the concrete slab that I have, you can see a bunch of little ridges here and a bunch of larger ridges farther down. Now the problem is these won't allow that first layer to sit flat, which means it'll either give us alignment issues or it'll physically cause this wall to tilt. The problem is even worse down here where we have all the cutaway to the ledge below and the more uneven foundation on that front half of the yard. Not only is it not level with those ridges, but there's also a slight gradient as we get farther away from the house towards that back fence. Another mini issue is that I don't have a great spot in my yard to put all that wood right now. If I put it against the back of the house, it's either going to block the door or block my access for carrying things in and out. And let's be real, that lumber is not exactly the lightest thing when you're moving that much of it. So I clearly have some logistics to figure out as well, but for now, let's just take the first piece in and start laying it down to see where the problem areas are. Rather than destroying my body as early as I possibly could, I decided to start simple. I only carried one board back and I made sure it was one that was relatively straight with the least amount of bowing that I could see on the top. And by starting with a good piece of lumber, we know that any imperfections or wobble that we're seeing is because of the surface below it. Now the first place I really tried this out was in that area where we saw a bunch of that concrete left over from the prior wall. And as you can see, there's a lot of wobble both forward and backwards as well as end to end on this piece. Meaning that there's a bunch of little high spots underneath that we're going to have to grind down in order to get this thing to sit properly. I found the same problem in other areas as well, but not nearly to the same extent, but we'll probably have to make some adjustments there. But one thing I don't think I anticipated well enough was that this gap here where it steps down will need to have perfect alignment to look good between that top level where most of that back row is versus that one step down where that next row is. Basically, that step has to be the perfect height to account for a single row, as well as being level with the entire rest of that run. Now looking at where the excavation company cut that leading edge, you can see it is not a perfectly straight cut, so I'm probably going to have to do some sort of a filling there. But even if I draw this board all the way to the front corner, I'm catching this inside corner edge here. That makes this thing sit too high, but if I push this thing any farther back, suddenly it doesn't line up and we've got gaps elsewhere. So what I quickly figured out is between the alignment issues, between the gaps, and between how much of a gradient that this has, both in this first section where we're going down that rock ledge, as well as the rest of the yard going towards that back set of stairs, I'm probably not going to be able to level this out unless I re-pour a new concrete footing, which is something I had not expected to do. Unfortunately, that means it's both a little extra scope and a little extra cost relative to what I planned, but if I don't do it, it's not going to look right. Like I said before, having a level starting point is probably one of the most critical steps to a good retaining wall because everything after that point is going to reference off that first surface. So if that first surface isn't any good, well, the rest of your wall is probably not going to be very good either. Getting the first road to be just right is probably the most time-consuming and important process, and everything after that goes very quickly, so you do not want to skimp out on this step. With all that said, let's jump forward a few days after some additional planning where I could finally start making the concrete mold. Welcome back. I am a man covered in sunblock. This is my unfinished yard, and that over there is a saw and some scrap wood that I'm going to be using today. So today's plan is getting that concrete mold done so I can actually get the concrete poured hopefully this weekend. It is about 9:30, 10 a.m. and it is already coming up on 90 degrees. So this is going to be an absolute scorcher, and I don't really have a whole lot of shade to utilize here. Let's get this done before the temperatures get even hotter. Now let me start by saying I am not a concrete expert, and this is the first big concrete project that I have done fully on my own. But generally speaking, what you're doing to make a concrete mold is you're effectively making a bathtub that you're going to fill with concrete. That bathtub will be made out of wood or a similar material. Then you pour the concrete into the bathtub, it dries up and gets the shape of whatever the form is that you have around it. Then you disassemble that form around it and you're left with only the concrete structure. Like I said, for here, what's really important is that I have a nice level top surface from one end of my yard all the way to the other. Otherwise, this retaining wall on top of it is not going to be level. And fortunately, I have a ton of scrap lumber and 2x4s and plywood that I really can't use for other things because it's either really knotted or dirty or warped. But for something like this, it is absolutely perfect. So what you'll see me doing is starting with a rough layout of where I want this mold to be, and then I start going into the details of trying to really level this out in different portions and make sure that this is actually going to line up once the concrete is inside of it. And while this might sound like a relatively simple task on paper, there was a lot of really tedious detailed parts that I wasn't necessarily expecting. Not the least of which was getting that step to line up properly, which I discussed before. Beyond the obvious part of just making the shape correct and to fit within the existing step that's there was also a lot of playing and finicking with this to try to make sure it was level, especially when I put that board with the surface above it. And while this maybe isn't rocket science, it's also not as simple as it first appears. I had to get really creative with how I built up the mold for that corner, so let's go into a little bit more detail on that. Now the difficulty here is that I have to try to level out this board, but I'm still pouring concrete to fill in the entire lower slab to basically create a new slab for that to sit onto. And as I've kind of shown in previous videos, this whole thing is all over the place. It's not level with itself, and it's not really cut straight on this edge here. So I needed something that could face off of this surface so that the concrete goes up to that, but then still leaves a groove low enough so that this will align with that next surface higher up, and I have exactly enough room for one board there, but that also fills any concrete behind it and below it as well. So this rickety looking thing is basically what I came up with, where this board sits on this surface, it allows it to fill out that way, and then it goes all the way out until this face here, which is where this is going to sit, and then this face, based on the height that that's going to be at, will create a level field for this to sit on so that all of this can be straight as well, and then I can stack those layers with this layer and everything will be perfect. So that took a couple hours, actually. That was a lot more complex than I thought it was going to be. That is where the bulk of my time today was spent. Or to summarize in fewer words, I used a whole lot of guess and check, and then just played with the fitment until I finally had a level that I was confident in and knew that these pieces lined up correctly. And now step 2 is going to be making sure that this entire thing is level from one end to the other. Now the old slab on the top is our first starting reference line because everything else will be new, so I'm going to start at this front corner to make sure we're level relative to that. Then I basically have to work from this front corner to that back where you see that rear staircase, and I have to make sure I'm level along that entire surface as well. And I thought about how I was going to do that with these 2x4s and how it would be very difficult to shave just a small amount down as I went along the entire length of them. What I'm going to do instead is put some plywood against the face of them, then I can just raise or lower that plywood, and because that plywood is a lot more thin, it's a lot easier to cut to the correct height. I also had a plan for the back side of the mold. I was going to stake a bunch of this warped plywood into the ground. The backside of this mold does not need to be precise, it doesn't need to be perfect or pretty, because quite frankly it's going to be buried in the ground and you're never going to see it. Therefore, as long as the slab was thick enough to support the weight that I was putting on top of it, it really didn't matter functionally what the back looked like. I realized, however, that the heat was definitely starting to get to me, so I decided to stop, rehydrate, and refuel, and while I was enjoying my lunch, I realized another potentially major oversight. We are now back. It's about 94 degrees outside. It feels even hotter now that I spent a few minutes in the air conditioning. But while I was eating lunch and while I was rehydrating, I was thinking about how I want to approach this, and even though I'm getting it leveled on that side first and coming out, what I was thinking about specifically was that I need this surface here to be level before I can worry about if the top surface is level, which means we have to clean all this up because it's rained a couple times pretty heavily in the last not only couple days but couple weeks. A lot of the sand and dirt and stuff has gotten washed down, and you can see it's kind of built up here on the edge. The problem being is we're going to be eventually putting a bead of caulk at the bottom there to kind of seal that so the concrete doesn't flow out further, but because we have to wash that all off anyhow, we might as well do it now so that we know we have a flat surface to start with. Otherwise, if we get everything level on the top and then we change the baseline, it's probably not going to be right. So let's get out the pressure washer. We'll do that next and then get back to this. I probably should have realized it sooner, but if I made this perfectly level, then removed half an inch of dirt at the bottom, that the top would no longer be level. So with my shovel and my pressure washer, I went and got most of the dirt off of that surface. And while I don't need this thing to be so clean that you can eat off of it, I do eventually need to put a line of silicone caulking on the bottom. That way none of the concrete seeps out of the bottom of the mold forward, which would just not look good. Now you'll also notice some of that front walkway had some very loose debris. I'm just going to refill that with fresh concrete when I'm repouring. The fact that I could already pick these pieces out by hand tells me that I should probably just repair them now. But once I was happy with how this was cleaned up, I started screwing the frame of this mold together. Now my camera actually overheated and didn't catch all of this, but I also ended up carving out this front corner over here by the stairs. The concrete ridges were so bad there that I actually could not get the 2x4 to sit level in that area. But with all these issues resolved, we're now ready to start doing the final leveling for this mold. For this weird jig I made for the bottom step, you'll see I'm actually using the level on it and then adjusting accordingly with some shims. And I also realized that first step has a big chip out in that front corner, so I'm also building out a little bit of the frame to cover that first corner to try to refill that in. From there, it was just a bunch of tedious work to make sure everything else was level as well as we moved farther back along the mold. Like I said, I'm putting a plywood faceboard on the back of these 2x4s just because it's easier to work with. So what I ended up doing is just clamping those to this 2x4 frame, adjusting it accordingly, making sure it was level along the entire length, and then pre-drilling and screwing it into place. Now ultimately, I wanted to get my mold really close, but I can still level this out with a trowel while the concrete is drying. So this doesn't have to be perfect. However, because I haven't done concrete before, I wanted to make it as close as I could get it. I know for a fact that my woodworking skills are a lot better than my concrete skills, so for me, the time spent here should hopefully help me out later on when I'm doing something that, quite frankly, I don't really know how to do well. But there is one other area where I had to get a little creative where it molds into that old staircase. So let's cover that in a little more detail. Now the only area that I had to get somewhat creative was down here at the very end. I knew that we have this little gap here that I'm going to be backfilling with the concrete, but I didn't have a good way to taper it into this face, and I don't want it to just be this like weird awkward corner sticking out. So what I did is, knowing that this plywood sheet is warped like all hell from storing it, cutting off one of the worst warped sections, I used the springiness to my advantage. I put 2 screws here, 1 screw here, and then the springiness is enough that it kind of tapers in on its own. So hopefully that'll give it like a nice smooth transition in, and that'll look a little bit better. Probably put like a cinder block or some weight there just to hold it in when we're doing the concrete pour. But that is good progress. At this point, the front half of the mold was all completed, and all we had to do was finish up the back half. Like I already said, that didn't need to be perfect, so getting this together was a lot more quick and a lot more simple. Because I know the front surface is already level, I can just reference off of that when I'm pouring the concrete, so I didn't worry about making this back surface level as well. If you really wanted to, you could, and honestly, it would probably have made the job a little bit easier, as I found out later on, but it's not totally necessary, and the time that I saved here more than makes up for the extra time that I would have consumed doing it the other way. So ultimately, this was still a net gain for me. But with those final steps, the concrete mold is now completed. All right, the concrete mold is now done. It actually was a little bit easier and quicker than I thought it would be. The only thing that I think I was a little worried about was if there was any rocks underneath over there, then that section wouldn't go down. And because I want a 10-inch depth across the entire thing from front to back, because of the warping within this plywood, this is kind of like springing forward. So once the concrete's in there, that'll
that'll push it back a little bit, and then it should still catch on this rock, so that shouldn't be too bad. But in the meantime, you got these two pieces acting together like a spring, and it's kind of pulling it forward a little bit. So real quick, I'm gonna get all these other things inside. I'm gonna run to the store, and we will resume when we are ready to pour, which is hopefully gonna be tonight.
That'll do it for this episode, and I'll see you guys next time when I'm mixing 900 pounds of concrete by hand because I'm an imbecile. But I want to thank you guys for watching, and I will see you next time.